Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary. My name is Tyler Marston, and today we're taking a look at Numbers chapter 30. God is continuing to give instructions for his people as a part of his terms to his covenant. And this chapter is a little bit of a controversial one, revolving around keeping vows. It's a concept that we're not super familiar with in American society and culture, which in turn makes the concessions allowed to the vulnerable women in this chapter all the more confusing. God expects our word to mean something, whether we're promising something to him or if we're promising something to other people. We'll also look at this through the light of what Jesus has to say on the matter, and how God desires for all of us, men and women, to live lives of integrity and honesty. And while we're doing that, we should also look out for the vulnerable, protecting those who might not understand the full scope of everything they're promising. Then Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the sons of Israel, saying, "This is the word which the Lord has commanded. If a man makes a vow to the Lord, or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." God instructs the people to keep their promises, and in that culture, that meant honoring their vows and their oaths. It's a good practice in general to be trustworthy and to keep your word, but many ancient cultures, including the Israelites, took this concept a lot more seriously than we do in 21st century America. Oftentimes, people would invoke the name of a deity or of a sacred space to get people to know they were serious about their commitment. And here in Numbers, God says, if you make a vow like that, you better make sure you keep it. Meanwhile, in the future, Jesus says that you really shouldn't have to make vows or oaths like that at all. When you tell someone you'll do something, that should be enough for them to know that you're going to follow up on that commitment. And that's what Jesus means by letting your yes be yes and your no be no. Now, we should be reading all of this in light of what we discussed in Numbers 23, how God displayed faithfulness to his word and faithfulness to his covenant, specifically in refusing to let Balaam curse the Israelites. Our God is a God who keeps his promises. Ergo, if we're supposed to reflect his image, we should keep our promises too. Now, with all that being said, there are some exceptions and concessions given in this chapter. Also, if a woman makes a vow to the Lord and binds herself by an obligation in her father's house in her youth, and her father hears her vow and her obligation by which she has bound herself, and her father says nothing to her, then all her vows shall stand, and every obligation by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if her father should forbid her on the day he hears of it, none of her vows or her obligations by which she has bound herself shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her because her father had forbidden her. The first concession is made for unmarried women who make vows while they're still living in their parents' house. The daughter will be held to the commitment she's made, just like anyone else in Israel, as long as her father hasn't vetoed it within a day of him hearing about it. This is a little bit of a controversial command, especially when it comes to our culture standards based on gender equality and our lessened value on keeping promises. Some might jump to accuse the text of assuming that daughters are just inherently more naive or less reliable. But we have to keep in mind that the Bible we're reading was not written for our cultural context. We have to do our best to step into its cultural context whenever we're reading it. The ancient Israelite culture we should be stepping into is patriarchal by default, based on the attitude of all the surrounding nations. Don't forget that in Genesis 1 and 2, God created men and women together to be in equal partnership, both reflecting his image and ruling together over his creation. Nevertheless, the ancient Israelites didn't value women as much as they should have, and that meant they weren't always able to get educations or have careers. We just talked about a few chapters earlier how they were only allowed to inherit land in rare circumstances, and even that was an act of radical inclusion for the time. And so this command about fathers being able to forbid their daughters from making certain vows, well, that wasn't made to keep women down. It was actually done to protect them, so that they couldn't make bad vows that they wouldn't be able to keep based on the lack of education that they had. However, if she should marry while under her vows, or the rash statement of her lips by which she has bound herself, and her husband hears of it and says nothing to her on the day he hears it, then her vows shall stand, and her obligations by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if on the day her husband hears of it, he forbids her, then he shall annul her vow which she is under, and the rash statement of her lips by which she has bound herself, and the Lord will forgive her. But the vow of a widow or of a divorced woman, everything by which she has bound herself, shall stand against her. However, if she vowed in her husband's house, or bound herself by an obligation with an oath, and her husband heard it, but said nothing to her, and did not forbid her, then all her vows shall stand, and every obligation by which she has bound herself shall stand. But if her husband indeed annuls them on the day he hears them, then whatever proceeds out of her lips concerning her vows or concerning the obligation of herself shall not stand. Her husband has annulled them, and the Lord will forgive her. This controversy only intensifies as we keep reading the chapter. Husbands are also given the ability to forbid their wives from making certain oaths that they disagree with. Now, it's limited in the same way, right? He can only overturn it on the day he hears about it, but the command is again a concession, and it's rooted in that same desire to protect vulnerable, uneducated women. Now, if you think I'm stretching here, take a minute and think about all the vows that were made by men in the biblical story that the people ended up regretting. Judges 11 tells the story of Jephthah and how he made an idiotic vow that cost him his daughter's life. Meanwhile, King Saul in 1 Samuel 14 made an equally dumb vow that almost cost him the life of his son and his battle commander. And so the point of these concessions is for the benefit of the vulnerable women in the specific context. God is allowing their husbands and their fathers to protect them from unintended consequences. And of course, with all that being said, it's not like the law holds women to such a low standard that they can't even make vows at all. Vows made by women that weren't annulled by their husbands or fathers are just as real and legally binding as vows made by men. And God holds widows and divorced women to that same standard. And that goes back all the way to Numbers chapter 6. Where women were explicitly included in being allowed to keep Nazirite vows and honor God with them. Every vow and every binding oath to humble herself, her husband may confirm it, or her husband may annul it. But if her husband indeed says nothing to her from day to day, then he confirms all her vows, or all her obligations which are on her. He has confirmed them, because he has said nothing to her on the day he heard them. But if indeed he annuls them after he has heard them, then he shall bear her guilt. These are the statutes which the Lord commanded Moses, as between a man and his wife, and as between a father and his daughter, while she is in her youth in her father's house. The final thing to understand here is that the vows and oaths made by women are to be kept by default. They really aren't to be held to any other standard than a vow or oath made by a man. It's only when a father or a husband takes the action to annul these vows that they become void. If he doesn't say anything either way, the woman is obligated to keep her commitment. And so God is still valuing and honoring these oaths and the women who make them. The controversy surrounding this chapter is rooted in misunderstanding, both in the patriarchal culture of ancient Israel and in the concept of oath-keeping in general. When we give these instructions proper analysis, we see that God always chooses to err on the side of protecting the weak and vulnerable. These women were uneducated. They weren't given great resources. And so concession was made on their behalf to allow fathers and husbands to be able to veto their vows. This was meant to protect women from keeping bad, regretful, or unkeepable vows, as happened many times to men throughout the Bible. And it's ultimately why we should all just listen to what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, we should keep our promises, but we shouldn't have to swear before God to get our friends to believe that we're telling the truth, or to believe that we'll pay them back. For all of us today, men and women, we need to let our yes be yes and our no be no, all the while staying ultimately committed to loving God and loving others. Thanks for watching 1189. I hope that you have a good day, and God bless.